Welcome to the World Builder's Anvil, episode 115. Today's topic, the art of the Tao of the chicken soup of the 7 habits of highly effective combat scene writers. Don't know where to start building your fantasy world? Do you need more? Does it make sense? Forget any worries and become a crafter of imagination. This is the place that will help prime your mind. Now, it's time to heat up the forge, break out the mithril ingots and hammer. Welcome to the World Builder's Anvil. I'm your host, Jeffrey W. Ingram. Let's sup from the mug of Java and build. Welcome back. As always, my name is Jeffrey W. Ingram.
And I'm Michael Miller.
And today we're going to talk about the art of war. Well, combat scene writing.
I love combat.
I know.
Good combat scene writing is some of my favorite, and I think a lot of people would agree. I mean, especially we're in a fantasy, supported genre of creation. Some of my favorite science fiction, The Electric Church, one of my favorite series. The combat sequences in those books are so visceral and so fun. Like I love the story and I love all the characters, but I love the combat scenes.
I like the way you describe that, because that will actually be part of what we're talking about here, because you pulled the theme of fun from their combat scenes, which is probably quite intentional, because typically most people don't do combat scenes for fun. They usually go for gritty or...
Well, the funny part about it is there's a lot of it is very gritty, but there is a portion of, because of something that occurs in, like, I think it's the 3rd book, where the character ends up I don't want to say joyful, but definitely excited about combat. Like he basically gains something that he didn't have before, and it changes how combat works for him. Okay. So when that occurs, the combat scenes feel different in that book, whereas in the other ones, it's terrifying, it's gritty, it's very like so it's really kind of an evolution towards
that.
Definitely. It's very much an evolution. In the earlier books, it's very Blade Runner. It's very William Gibson. Like that's kind of the world.
Isn't Blade Runner the movie, I'm assuming?
The movie, yeah. It's very gritty, low tech, futuristic combat. Like the real nasty gunners in the game. They're not using like spacey weapons. They're using just like old school.
I just want to say here from a personal standpoint, for me, when I watch science fiction and I hear the shells ejecting and slapping against the metal is much more appealing than laser blast. It might be a personal thing for me.
Unless it's Star Wars.
Okay. Well, but that's more because of the story. If from the beginning, their guns had bullets, I would have been happy. And I would have known no better. Even if in space they used the, because it would seem wrong having TIE fighters have different kinds of weapons, I guess. So, or that'd be one heck of a torpedo the Death Star was shooting.
Right. We need to blow up the whole planet. It's a big missile.
Okay.
So Jeff has gone to great pains. This episode was actually one of my ideas, but you have gone to great pains and preparation for this. And I'm excited by that because I didn't have the time to.
Yeah. And Mike has a natural affinity for combat scenes, not so much combat.
I would say between the two of us, you're more adept at
I'm probably a bit more adept at combat.
I'm probably more violent.
At this point of my life, definitely.
Yeah. But you're probably more adept at combat. Now, I take that as quite a compliment, though, when you say that I am. Would you say a second ago that like I'm
adept at combat?
At combat scenes, you think so?
I think you have a good eye for them when you're breaking that. When we talk about combat scenes, you're good at analyzing and breaking them down. I don't think I've ever read a combat scene from you or played in a game where in a game it's slightly different because it's an interactive combat scene,
but you still talk about it like, I mean, if you're doing a tabletop role playing game, as you very well know, if you're doing a tabletop role playing game and you're in a combat sequence, your thought process is still what you would do when you're writing, because you have to describe what's occurring.
But you're doing it for your character instead of everything.
And sometimes, actually most of the time, if you're doing tabletop, you're sitting there with other friends, you can throw visuals. You can move your arms and your hands and your feet in a way to suggest what you'd like to imply. But when we're dealing with the written word or game creation, you got to describe it all.
You got to describe it all. That is correct. And the big reason it's important is one, like Mike was saying earlier.
Michael.
Whoever the hell you are. We're going for explicit now, buddy. This is comedy.
That was your fault. The show just went explicit. Well, fuck it. All bets are off.
That's right. Exactly. Now
you can edit that out if you want.
The reason this is really important is when you think about most genre fiction, violence is a part of it. And sometimes it's small and it's used as sort of insertions to do things.
I want to change the way you word that just a little bit and say conflict, which in turn can be violence.
Yes, that's true, because there is a lot of good, especially science fiction, where my violence is never necessarily approached with the conflict.
My distinction there is that the violence and subsequently the combat scene, in my opinion, should be supported by a conflict, as opposed to just having a combat scene or violence for violence or combat's sake. Yeah. Now, I'm not totally against that either, but if you're trying to make a good story and have good story writing, I think everything should be supporting that, including your conflicts and your combat scenes.
And I think even the non-secular combat scenes in books, are either introducing characters or disposing of characters that are not necessarily important anymore. But there are ways to, for me, ultimately, combat scenes are a way for propelling a story. And I think in most books I enjoy that include combat. Combat is not in there for combat's sake. However, if that's the story you want to tell, go do it. I mean, there's plenty of mindless action movies,
and there's plenty of great ones.
Yeah,
there's plenty of movies out there where there's not a whole lot of thought process going on to it.
For me as a reader, though, I prefer non-mindless reading.
Oh, yeah, fair enough. But as far as like movie watching goes, I'm a big fan of one of my favorite movies to watch, if done correctly, is a good old fashioned violent revenge movie. And the first two that come to mind are John Wick. If you haven't seen John Wick, go watch John Wick. John Wick 2 is coming. That is a great, very basic story. It is a very, very basic revenge plot. Yeah. That's all.
And there are actually a lot of great revenge movies.
Number 2, Faster. This movie was in and out of theaters, in and out of video. No one paid
its name, huh?
Nobody paid attention to this movie. It's a movie with The Rock where it's just a simple revenge plot. Very simple, but great characters, very intense drama built into a story that really is skin deep. Yeah. But everybody that came into that movie put a lot more into it. And I really wish that movie had done better than it apparently did. But I tell anyone, if you want to watch a really good action revenge plot, that movie, Faster, is a lot more surprising than you'd expect.
I think there has been one very important lesson learned from revenge movies over the past decade.
What's that?
Liam Neeson is a horrible parent. Horrible.
A horrible parent, yes.
Horrible
Terry
parent.
Cannot keep track of that kid.
Or possibly a serial killer who somehow encourages the kidnappings to happen to give him the excuse to go out.
But this is good story. This is good storytelling. So, for the purposes of what we're talking about today, most of this really falls into you writing a story, writing a combat scene. We won't get into like most of like the movie aspects or the video game aspects or the tabletop role-playing aspects of it, while a lot of the story telling will lend itself to tabletop.
Yes.
Which we'll get into later at some point.
Or really even games and movies too.
Sure.
Except for the bonus is really anti-movie. Because in movies, they're going to be completely perfectly choreographed where, the bonus one is not.
The one thing I will say is for the sake of research, and this, I'm going to say this for books and for movies or any type of storytelling, watch the movie X vs. Sever. This movie is terrible. You won't enjoy it. The reason I want you to watch it.
As a punishment?
Not a punishment, but I want you to watch it for the, there's a chase sequence in it, and there's some combat sequences in it. The reason I think this is an important movie is because that movie tries to move along quickly. But when you get to those sequences, you realize the movie slows down. Like there's a chase sequence in it where it looks like they're going 30 miles an hour. And odds are they probably were for most of it. And for most chase sequences, they're driving a lot slower than you think they are. But movie magic makes it look more sped up and scary and
Which is
heightened.
why when the hubcap comes off, it looks hokey.
Right. Well, in this movie, things look terribly slow. And that's what we want to try to, this list, the purpose of this list is to prevent you from writing the equivalent of that sequence. Like, we don't want you to get to the combat sequence and have it slow your tail down. It should heighten the experience and put the reader on edge. I mean, if that's the intention. There are some combat sequences that I've read that seemed more intimate and almost like a love scene between characters in some cases.
Like any John Woo movie has one of those.
Well, I wouldn't go so much as far as that, but like, you know, where there might be characters where, Batman and Catwoman. Sure, they're
you're talking about literally love sequences.
Well, sometimes. You know, there's other ones. Well, actually, I guess you could. I was about to go with like Desperado sort of stuff. So a little bit of Robert Rodriguez, and he kind of lends himself to some John Woo stuff too. So okay,
I think John Woo, the classic John Woo thing are the two people who are now at that one moment of time where the pistols are in each other's faces, and they're making the call, and they're usually friends either from the opposite sides that respect each other,
or enemies that respect each other.
Enemies that respect each other.
Enemies that sometimes don't necessarily even want to shoot the other guy. You know, like very much like, to make a Princess Bride references, the Man in Black and Inigo Montoya, when they fight, they don't want to hurt each other. They're
it's a complete respect fest.
Exactly. So we would much rather have you write that sort of experience for your readers and for your avatars than what X versus Severed does. And just as a means of to show you what not to do, I recommend watching that movie, but for no other reason.
Yes.
So the list.
Yes. So the first thing is, use the combat scene to affect your story. And at this point, we're not going to go largely into this because we've kind of been talking about this as the why. Remember that all of the things that you use in your book are really advancing the story. And I'm purposely not saying plot, because not everything in a story will directly advance a plot. They might be finishing off subplots or creating new subplots or perhaps foreshadowing a future plot.
Or it might just be character development sometimes.
Or character development, you know, I mean.
Or character introduction.
Think about, you know, you want to introduce someone in your novel who's, or in your story who's a hardened veteran. There's nothing quite like the scene where you have this sort of calm, competent individual performing his job, which in this case would be destroying half of a army by himself, if you want to go in the less realistic route.
Right.
But, you know, that scene describes him that way.
Yeah. I like it when you get to introduce a character by combat. Like, here's a guy you don't know. I mean, how many movies, how many books, how many video games or anything have you been exposed to where everyone sort of turns to the end of the bar and there's a guy that's just sitting there alone and no one's bothering him, and then someone decides to bother him?
Yes.
And you don't know what's going to happen. Or the stranger walks into the bar and no one knows what's going to happen.
And they're all watching him. And then sort of classic Western trope.
Well, that's exactly what I'm thinking, is like a Clint Eastwood or whatever. And of course, somebody challenges that character. And then as the avatars, the reader or viewer, you get introduced to this character through combat.
And for my personal taste, that doesn't necessarily have to happen in a bar. But come on, folks. Yeah. It's so much better when it does.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun.
Okay, so number 2, understand what the goal of your scene is. And by this, I'm saying, what sort of emotions are you trying to leave with the person once they view the scene? One of the things to keep in mind when you are doing this is to know the purpose of your combat scene. And by that, what I'm saying is, what kind of emotions are you really trying to convey to the person who's interacting with the story from the other side? Do you want to show the horrors of war? Do you want to show maybe the villainous nature of a protagonist or maybe an antagonist, depending on how your story's written?
Yeah, knowing what your goal is walking into writing the sequence is going to color the language you choose to use. Like if you want it to be like, well, this is a violent scene and I want the reader to be disgusted with it, You're not going to talk about it colorfully and fun and joyfully like, oh, he did this really cool acrobatic dodge and then punched the guy in the face and cracked a joke. No, you're going to say stuff that's a lot more like, oh, when he hit him, it was like grisly and bone breaking and everybody cringed and, stuff like that.
And, if you're trying to make your villain appear more villainous, you will not have him saving the women and children of the village before he burns it to the ground. You would do that if you're trying to humanize your villain.
Right. So what's the goal of your scene? Know that.
And I always kind of like to know that in my head. And usually I kind of do. Or, for example, too, how do you want to affect the pacing? So do you want a slower combat scene so the person can possibly immerse more into it? Or do you want it to feel more like a combat scene where it's swish, swish, and things are over almost as soon as they begin? And I think there should be a certain consistency with that kind of pacing, unless a character or something forces certain scenes to be different.
I like it when a combat scene draws me in a way where I'm scared for the characters and I feel like, even though I'm just sitting still and reading, like I'm getting nervous and I'm getting anxious because I feel an imminent danger or a speed that's going on because combat happens quickly.
Yeah.
But it's also fun when you read sequences where they purposefully slow it down, where especially
and
where
you hear some of those examples earlier too, where it's like you can feel the emotion between the characters at that moment, whatever the emotion is.
Or like when you have a character that is just so badass that he either saunters through a combat sequence or combat occurs at his chosen pace, which is also really fun.
Okay, I have to right now throw up a quick Jessica Jones spoiler alert. And it's not a huge spoiler alert.
Okay.
But it's a minor one.
So for those of you, if you have not watched Jessica Jones, definitely skip ahead, say what, a minute?
We'll say a minute.
Skip forward a minute right now.
Nothing major here that will be given away, but just be warned, spoiler starting now. The introduction of Luke Cage fighting in the bar.
Yeah, that is a good scene.
You are convinced that he has absolutely zero fear.
Yeah.
Yeah,
absolutely. He gets attacked in ways that a normal man should not. One, should be terrified of, and two, should react differently to.
And he looks bored.
And he looks bored and not afraid at all. And you're like, holy crap, this guy! Like, what's with this guy? And then you realize he's so badass and so powerful.
Yes.
So, all right, spoilers done. If you're not watching Jessica Jones and you just said, screw it, I'm going to listen through the spoiler anyway, watch Jessica Jones. That show is excellent. I will say this. The first, say, half of the season is really good, but it is slower paced. The second half is so riveting. It's some of the best television I've watched.
Yes. I will say I enjoyed it more than Daredevil, which I enjoyed tremendously.
I still think I enjoyed Daredevil more, but I enjoy. You know what? They're different. They're very different. So it's unfair to compare the two.
It's not fair to compare them, except for they're superheroes in the sort of same part of the Marvel universe. The only reason I say that, I was very disappointed with the suit reveal.
With the what?
The suit reveal in Daredevil.
I was too.
Yeah,
because I liked what he started out in better. But that's because I'm such a fan of Iron Fist, and I was like, he's wearing Iron Fist.
Yes. It was not quite the way I wanted it to look. And that's a lame geek.
The thing is, though, you could literally make it look almost identical to what you see in the comic book, but just have it be padded armor, and that'd be fine. I even like the one they did in the movie better.
It's padded armor. It could have been silk, and I would have been like, okay.
The one they did in the Ben Affleck movie, I liked better.
That was actually a good suit.
Yeah,
and
terrible movie. It was a good suit. Good suit. Anyway, so just quick recap. Number 1, use your combat scene to advance your story. Number 2, understand what the goal of the scene is before you get into it. Number
3 is decide on how real or fictitious you want it. Do you want that manga style Dragon Ball Z combat, which I consider one end of the spectrum?
Yeah, very far.
The realistic,
the spectrum, yeah.
And
or I'm going to go with History of Violence.
I've not seen that, but I assume
that is also a comic book. It's very gritty. It's very realistic. Okay, and this also lends itself great to combat scene references. If you ask me throughout the entirety of that movie, the most, I'm going to use air quotes here, violent sequence in the movie is where one person slaps another. Now, I'm talking about a movie where dudes get stabbed, dudes get shot. There's some really visceral combat in very early in the movie, but it doesn't, and while it hits you heavy, it doesn't hit you anywhere near as emotionally impactful as there's a scene deep in the movie where one person slaps another, and that seems throughout all the movie is the more violent than everything else because it's so effectively delivered.
A lot of times, especially in more modern combat, where there isn't person-on-person contact necessarily, violence is not necessarily bloody, and like I said, it might not have the feeling of violence. And this is actually a warning too, and this is a great story. I don't know if I mentioned it before in the show. Years ago, there was a company who released a video game into beta, and they wanted it tested out to get feedback from people.
I think I might know this.
And I don't remember the game, but it started at, it's a first-person shooter game, so if anyone in this room would know it, it would be
Michael.
Or Michael, either one. And the idea of it was it was sort of this urban combat fighting arena. And
a PC launch?
It was a PC launch.
Okay.
And during the beta, there were lots of massive complaints from people.
Because the gameplay was bad?
No, the gameplay was
because
good.
of the content, I'm sure.
No, it was more the problem they had with it it was just too unrealistic. The gunfire
seems odd to me that video game players would be complaining about a lack of realism.
Yes, especially when you know the actual truth of the development of the game, which was they did it for a discount for the Marines to do urban combat training in for their officers so they could actually get some kind of exposure towards what it would feel like to be in an urban combat situation.
So their goal was probably a very realistic
experience.
Okay.
But the gunfire just didn't sound loud enough. And
oh, so it was real, but
the explosions were just too lame. They didn't have any real explosiveness behind them.
Got you. People were used to bombastic video game style violence.
Watching the action movies, watching these other realistic first-person shooter games, which are horrible for realism. They're very cartoony, which I have nothing against that. I like all forms. I actually kind of prefer it more cartoony than realistic myself, unless your point is to shock and disturb people with violence. Real violence is much more intimate and not necessarily as violent. Now, if you get into older forms of combat where there are swords and you have men within a foot or two of each other trying to end the other one's life, that's completely different. And I can't speak from experience. But, just the thought of being up there, face to face with someone trying to kill them before they kill you is a completely different mindset, where the best way to say it was the Army really trained you to make it more like a video game. Target pops up, target pops down. It moves very quickly. You will do bad actions before you consider the consequences. Look at how realistic you want it to be and understand if you make it too realistic, too far away from the expectations of your audience, they might not believe it, even if it's actually realistic.
And also keep it consistent with your world. In some world, like I wouldn't expect realistic combat in a medieval fantasy setting. I expect my combat to be a little larger than life when the story is larger than life.
Yes, when Legolas steps to the battlefield, you don't want realistic. You want Legolas.
Exactly. Yeah. I don't want his arrows to fly only a few hundred yards, which is what they should fly. I want to see them fly half a mile.
Into someone's eye socket.
Into someone's eye socket with his purposeful precision. And both target and launching point are moving. Yes.
And it gets the guy behind him as well.
Of course. Or like when he stabs one person with the arrow, draws it back out, and then fires it into someone else.
Which was possibly my favorite combat move in the trilogy.
Yeah, that was a pretty good one.
Just because of the smoothness of it and how well it worked for him.
Yeah.
Okay, so number 4. One of my favorites. Go ahead, read it.
I would love to, but I can't read your writing. I was going to read.
You're going to, but then you
I realized no, it's not that I lack courage. I don't know what you wrote.
Yeah, he lacks courage.
Ensure characters. Oh, ensure characters are represented.
Yes.
Okay. Number 4. Ensure characters are represented.
So essentially, the idea is if you have the character Mike,
which isn't me,
which isn't Michael, of course
but
not. The character named Mike in the story.
Now, this character sounds really combat cool. I'm thinking this guy's super cool.
Yeah, it's nothing like you.
Nothing like
He's a Mike. And his character does not disappear. Now, it might alter in the combat stage. There might be differences about it. Maybe he's a berserker. Maybe he's a coward.
I can't believe you just said that, because as you said that, it reminded me of a fantasy book I read a long time ago where the character was a berserker, but until the first combat sequence, that wasn't revealed. And the character was very reserved. But when then combat started occurring and it came out that he was a berserker, and he was literally looked like a porcupine at one point because he had so many arrows in him, but he was still fighting.
Or if you want to go for the knightly version of berserker, it's Lancelot. Basically he gets an uncontrolled bloodlust in combat and has trouble stopping, or at least in certain versions of Lancelot.
I would say I didn't know that about Lancelot.
Yep, no, he was bloodthirsty.
Yeah.
Once the fight started, but he was slow to pick up the sword to do it, and thus honor was at stake. But many versions of him, once he did that,
you don't want to be in the way.
You better be able to run faster scared than he can angry. Okay.
Because he's pretty angry. So represent your character. Make sure your character doesn't vanish because combat's arrived.
Yeah. And number 5.
Tell a mini story of the fighting style?
Or styles. It would depend. So
what do you mean by that? Tell a mini story of the fighting style.
The fight itself can be broken down in a story of how they're fighting. So essentially, if you have a sword and shield person, that is a story in how he's using the two in conjunction with each other. And it doesn't have to be overly laid out, but essentially, the coordination of the bash sword attack versus the guy across the table from him who possibly has a two-handed sword that he's manipulating somewhere between a staff and an actual sword, depending on what's going on in the fight. So the moves they're making are a story themselves. And there's a flow to them. So especially in melee combat, there's a flow to melee combat that is needed.
See, now why do you do that? Melee. I say melee.
Tomato.
Really? There's not one appropriate way to say that word. But I hear other guys, because there's a melee strike in Destiny, which I play all the time.
Melee strike.
And people will say melee, and I'm like, melee is a worm, not a combat term. Melee worms.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry, Michael, that we offended you on your European sensibilities.
my delicate desires to have the word pronounced appropriately.
Yes.
Yes, pronounced. Okay. I said that.
Yeah.
Melee combat.
All I can say is Missouri.
Are you just referring to the fact that it's not said the way it's written down?
Well, actually, there's 2 pronunciations to the state, depending on where you are in the state. Pronunciations of words that are spelled the same in English do have multiple sounds to them.
I know that, but I think you're wrong.
Quite possibly, because I was not taught phonics. I have learned to say words.
But you're not the only person I've ever heard say it that way. That's what. But I just think it grates on my ears when I hear that word.
Excellent.
Missouri. Is that the other one?
Missouri. Yeah.
Missouri. Yeah.
Ohio.
Or New Orleans. You ask someone in the north.
I think, but yeah.
Ask someone in the north, it's New Orleans.
For me, it's up to the locals. So,
of course,
Missouri, that depends on where you're at in Missouri. Nevada. I'm making that one.
Oh, okay. I was going to say, I've never heard there's an R in there. Well, actually, you take a look at we talked about all the Massachusetts towns where
exactly.
There's literally a bunch of letters that they don't pronounce at all.
It's like, and I remember getting into these kind of arguments and acting, on stage where
Connecticut.
People would say, "Oh no, the word is," and you're like, "Yeah, the character I am lives in a small town in the South. He might not say it the French pronunciation, even though that really wasn't a French word. I lied.
He speaks Creole." So this all came from number 5. Tell a mini story in the fighting style.
Yeah. So essentially, allow the story to unfold in how they're fighting. There's a momentum behind the movements. The great thing with modern weapons is you can really just take away from that with sudden sharp endings and stuff due to the style of weapons. But especially if it's sword and shield, sword, martial, fisticuffs. You
also consider how somebody learns or decides on what martial style they want to use. That lends itself to who they are as a character.
Yeah.
Like if you've got a guy who doesn't want to do a lot of fighting and he wants to make sure to protect people, he's probably going to have a big shield and a sword, as opposed to somebody that wants to hurt a lot of people but doesn't want to get too close. Well, he's going to have a bow and arrow. You know what I mean? Like people choose their weapons based on their personalities. So you don't want to make something that's too contradictory. That's not the right word. It can be contradictory. It can be contradictory, but something that doesn't seem to lend itself to the character appropriately. So,
and the other thing too is people from different cultures are going to use similar types of weapons in different ways. Think of a samurai standing face to face with a European crusader knight,
right?
And they both only have swords. They're going to fight completely differently and will probably shock each other if they've never fought someone like that before.
Right. Number 6.
Actually, I have to give a quick story about that.
Okay, go for
it. And I credit this one to Terry Jones from Monty Python fame during one of his history documentaries. And essentially, this is when the Norman Knights finally arrived in Anatolia and finally found the actual Turks. And so you have this huge, massive line of Norman heavy cavalry on the ridge, and you have this huge, bigger mass of Turkish light cavalry down below. And these two groups had never fought each other. The Turks had already dispatched the first wave of Europeans that came through, who were actually all peasants and didn't really have the martial training, but these were this was the Norman war machine.
Yeah, this is an army.
This is an army of hardcore killers. And they had two completely different fighting styles. Normans ride on stallions. Stallions, big beefy stallions who aren't afraid to be right up there and hearing the smashing and gnashing of teeth. A Norman warhorse will bite your arm. It will attack you as well if it can. Vicious, mean, ruthless to match the person on the back. And of course, everyone knows how Norman knights fight. They drop lance and they go and they charge. That is the Norman preferred battle tactic. Turkish cavalry, on the other hand, does not fight that way. What they'll do is they will shoot arrows, and they're on mares, which have a much more endurance. They don't have the quick acceleration of the stallions, but they can ride fast for a long time. And the Turks will sit back and they'll try and stay out of your reach, and they'll shoot arrows and shoot arrows. Once it appears that you're shattered, that's when they'll charge in. So they try and break you before they engage their troops in on you closely.
Seems like a good strategy.
And especially in that part of the world, especially when you get into the plains of the Middle East, that's a very effective fighting style. Both very effective fighting styles in that time. And this is the first time these two fighting styles matched. So the Normans see the Turks, and the signal goes off, the lances come down, and you have, I don't know, we'll make up a number here, 10,000 heavy cavalry drop lance and charge into this much larger group of Turkish horsemen. So the Normans on the stallions charge into the group of mares with the Turkish warriors. And for those of you who don't understand the difference between those terms, a stallion is a male horse, a mare is a female horse. And according to legend, it was sort of a very embarrassing loss for the Turks, as they were sort of ridden off the field, you might say. So,
like
literally, there were rumors of that, but I mean, the Normans really did shot because they weren't wild. What the charge itself, and it was probably more of a shatter, and most of the troops probably started retreating right away because they had no idea what was even going on. But the rumors of the time that the stallions and mares, one of the rumors was the mares were in heat. And that caused extra weirdness on the battlefield.
So the horses got along better than the men.
They got along better than the men. And it's just one of those things to keep in mind is the strangest things can happen, especially at first contact at a first fight. When you don't know the other person's style, it could be awkward.
Another quick reference, another quick movie reference for tell a mini story of the fighting styles. I don't know that it came across perfectly clearly in the movie itself. The movie called The One, which is a Jet Li movie in which he plays multiple characters. And the basic gist is that one version of himself figures out how to jump into different dimensions.
Is he trying to kill himself? And
he keeps killing versions of himself. And the idea is that with no matter how many versions of yourself, they said, I think it's like 99 different universes. Yeah. And they said with every version of yourself that you kill, the energy of you as a one being doesn't diminish. So if you have 99 versions of yourself and you kill one of them, the remaining 98 get a little stronger. So he's trying to kill all of them so he can become uber powerful. Mm-hmm. Now, the interesting thing is
well, I would want to fight one Jet Li, but okay.
Right. So the interesting thing is the conflict ends up being the bad guy Jet Li versus a good guy Jet Li, but they're both getting more powerful as bad guy is killing more Jet Lis.
Yeah.
And the thing
that's true because they're both
the
energy's
one.
Equal, not
exactly. Okay. They're both one, so they both keep getting stronger. But the interesting thing was Jet Li as an actor is playing two very different characters, and I don't know if it was his choice or the director's choice or whatever. As the bad guy, he uses a specific form of kung fu that constantly attacks in a straight line. His mindset is forward and dominate, and his kung fu style is forward and dominate. The good guy,
perfect example.
The good guy's combat style is circular. All of his kung fu kata and motions are all about deviating energy and moving around the person you're fighting. So one is all about moving forward, and the other one is all about moving to the side and moving around. So it's not perfectly apparent because as a Westerner who's very big on kung fu but is not a schooled kung fu expert, I'm not noticing these differences in the combat.
But once you learn it,
you learn it, that's interesting that they went to that trouble to have them fight very differently.
And that's exactly what we're talking about.
And that's exactly what we're talking about. What I will say is that movie's okay. Some of the combat sequences are cool, but watch the makings of it. And that should be on the DVD. That's how I knew this because I'd watched the makings of it. And they talked about the characterization of the good guy versus the bad guy and their fighting styles and why they did the things that they did.
Awesome. So that just I have to because I think I saw that. I have to go rewatch it.
It's not like I said. It's a good.
It's
movie.
One of his later.
It's a good movie. It's not a great.
It's one of his later ones before they start doing the really super expensive ones.
Right. And the combat sequences in that movie are very good and they're fun.
Yeah, in all Jet Li movies, no matter how good they are, the fight scenes are always good. Yeah.
Pretty much.
Okay, so we're going to move on to number 6 here.
Understand the fight.
Yeah, and there's a couple different ways to take that, and you're right no matter how you take that. But primarily, it's about the physicality of the fight. What is the size of the battlefield? Where are the parties located at the beginning? Where do they move during the fight? It's very good to sketch these things out in your mind so you have an idea of what's happening before you start writing, because especially the larger the area of the fight, the harder it might be. And depending on the kinds of fights that you do, if you're doing a sniper duel, it's kind of slow and methodical if you do it accurately. You definitely would not want to do a sniper duel completely accurately because they move very, very slowly. But they're always changing locations. You know, they're always trying to keep their distance from each other. They're trying to get the better angle to get the shot off to kill the other person.
Nothing takes me, I'll say it differently. Few things take me out of a story or out of a sequence like a description contradicting itself or saying something that doesn't make sense in conjunction with other information that's already been established. Yeah. If you have like, he had a knife, the only knife in the kitchen was on top of the refrigerator. And then partway through, he's on the other side of the kitchen during the combat sequence, and he grabs a knife from the counter. It's like, well, you just said the only knife in the is on top of the fridge. Like,
except for,
yeah, I don't like that at all. If you ever
played role-playing games,
like you will
sooner or later run into that combat issue where either a game master doesn't describe it well, or the player isn't listening, or both.
Right,
which is more likely to be the truth, that they both are a little screwed up. And they don't want to back off of what they've said.
Of course.
And so this is a fight I've actually seen in role-playing games.
Tons of times.
But the same way...
The more important point here is, though, understand the physicality of the fight. Like, you want to describe, this guy punched that guy, this guy punched that guy, and then this happened, and then this happened. Like, you have the story in your head. But you should actually have the physical existence, the three-dimensional aspect of the fight should be in your mind, if not sketched out. Like, you should know exactly what is actually occurring. So when you describe it, it makes sense.
Yeah, most definitely.
One of my fun ones was there was a tabletop game that we played where my character always had a katana. It was a cyberpunk style campaign, futuristic, but he had a monomolecular katana all the time. And at one point in time in the fight, basically it's me and one other guy were disarmed, like, and we all have guns. So they're like, you know, get rid of, drop your guns. We drop our guns. And this guy's in my face, and my character has bloodlust and like quick to anger. Like, he's a violent guy. And there's like 4 people around us. They all have guns trained on us. There's nothing we can do. We're surrounded. We've got our hands on our heads. And then this guy's just prodding me. And I'm like, I tell the GM, I said, okay, I fast draw my katana, cut his head off. And he's like, oh, he had forgotten that I had a sword on. And I wasn't going to say, oh, don't forget, I have a sword on me. Make sure he sees the sword and makes me get rid of the sword. I wasn't going to. If he didn't remember it, well, then the character didn't think to say, take that sword off. Which is something that's definitely, I think, when you're role-playing games. A little cheap, I know. But he didn't remember. It was fair. I think it's fair in a role-playing game. Yeah. In a book, you would be more careful for that, because why would the trained, you know, guys with guns around him not realize? Right. He would see the hilt sticking way off my back. But as a game master, sometimes you got to give your players that the same way you should stop them when they're sort of being a little sleazy the opposite way. When they forget the person has the sword. I'll have to finish that story for you at some point. But that action was followed by a critical success roll, and hilarity ensued. So, number 7. Okay, the big finish here. You take us on home, Michael. Make the fight affect the characters. Yes, fighting is something that should develop characters, unless the whole point of the story is to not develop characters. Or unless the character has been so developed by combat that combat doesn't affect him much, and that should be apparent. Effect, yeah. But that would, but in that circumstance, I'd say it's affecting the reader, not necessarily the character. Yeah, and I would say it probably is affecting them, although it might not be apparent at that point in the story. But there would that would be the classic character to bring it to a head at some point later, where they end up becoming sociopathic almost or something. You know, there are ways you can take it. Reminds me of like a Wolverine. Like, how many fights has he been in? How many people has he killed? How many times has someone tried to take him down? And every once in a while, he has a psychological breakdown. Every once in a while, yeah. And if you're Psylocke, don't go in his head. Yeah, you don't want to do that. Don't do that. No. But yeah, a fight should affect somebody. Like, somebody should not walk away from a fight completely unscathed, physically or mentally. Yeah, mentally at least, if not physically. Easy to remember. Yeah. If his head's chopped off, that's going to be an obvious effect on the character. Right. But even if the character comes out of it completely unscathed physically, mentally it should still have an impact. Especially, first fight. That's probably not what the person was expecting. Right. Probably didn't know what to expect or how it was going to affect them. So you want to go through the whole list real quick? Why don't you knock them off for us? Why don't you, because you're going to read them easier than I am. So first, use it to advance your story. Second, understand what the goal of your scene is. 3, decide on how realistic you want your fight to be. 4, ensure characters are represented. 5, tell a mini story of the fighting styles. 6, understand the fight. And 7, and final, make the fight affect the characters. Oh, and there's a bonus. Yeah, I was going to say, you have a bonus there too. And this is especially for people when you are writing a story for people to read. Don't forget there's a reader involved in it. You don't need to explain precisely how arms are moving for every sword swipe. You don't need to represent every possible movement that happens within the scene. Let the readers do their job. And they fill in the details in books all of the time. Tell enough. And tell what you need to tell. If it's important to describe how his arm's moving at one specific point of the fight, that's okay. But just don't do it at every point of the fight. Yeah, there's something that a fellow writer friend of ours says a lot, and it's something I need to remind myself of, is show me, don't tell me. Like, you don't have to break down everything so nitpicky in every little piece of detail. That can get very boring and tedious to read. Show me what's occurring. Describe what's occurring in a way that I can build a visual in my head. You know, I mean, that's a very wise statement. I mean, it's so good. I wish a Canadian rock band would write a song about it.
Sorry.
We don't say show me, don't tell me enough. And I think it's something that should become a mantra.
Especially when you are writing.
Yeah. So what's the world builder task for the day?
Write a fight scene where this guy named Mike gets beaten up.
Yeah, and it'll definitely be like his cousin Michael who will come back and assuredly kill Jeffrey, who was the one that beat up Michael in the first place. It's going to be savage. There's going to be pieces of Jeffrey around, and I can't wait. Send them to the website. I just want lots of violent sequences where Jeffrey gets killed and maimed and beaten. It's going to be so much fun.
This is like workplace violence. It's too fun to be like.
Does this count as harassment? How about the real world task of the day?
Okay.
I want you to get into a fight and you're going to lose. Go pick a fight with somebody and lose. Okay. I'm kidding. I'm not. That's a joke. I'm referencing Fight Club.
No, we're going to be serious now.
Yeah, seriously.
Especially, we're getting to spring. It's starting to get warmer, but sometimes it gets cold. There are animals out there. There are rabbits. There are turkeys. There are all sorts of animals out there. They get cold too. So make sure to bring them in and warm them up in your oven. And then eat them. Oh, I'm sorry. That's another joke.
That's another joke. That's a joke.
Okay.
Actually, no. I mean, look, you eat a rabbit, a turkey, or chicken.
That's actually serious too for me, but not necessarily for the listener. Now, really study up on the kinds of weapons you want to use in your world. And if you have something unique that you've created for your world, try and find something that would sort of match its physics in our world so you can study how people use the weapon. There are lots of really strange and interesting weapons. Mike could look behind him right now, or Michael, either one. I was going to say
Michael might do it.
There are like tons of books about weapons out there. Go look up, find one that you like the way it looks, or, you know, if you use the classics, there's a reason why lots of people use swords and axes. And arrows and quartz.
Well, to be fair, swords and axes, of course, effective, but I think that lends itself more to they're easy to produce.
I said there are reasons.
Yeah, those are the reasons.
And swords are very effective at hurting people too, and so are axes.
Axes are great because you don't have to be super well trained to wield one.
Yeah,
you need to be more well trained to be effective with a sword.
And the way they can be made can even make them more effective. The Frankish axe was known because when it would be thrown, and if it would fall short, it would actually almost always bounce. So if you were a little short on your target, or if they had a big shield in front of them, you threw it at their feet and it would bounce up into them.
Yeah,
it was a very nasty weapon. That's why they're called the Franks, because that was the name of the axe, even though that's the English name of it.
Yeah. So do some weapon research. And there's a lot of great documentaries on old warfare and ancient warfare weapons. And
go buy wiffle ball bats and just take a friend outside and start beating the snot out of each other. No, don't do that.
The World Builder's Anvil does not condone violence against your fellow man.
Don't go start a fight with someone like Michael says, or like actually Jeff also ended up saying. Do cook up animals that are cold. It's not nice to leave them cold. But also study some weapons.
What's a tease?
It's your favorite. Simple, succinct, tech levels. A new system. And as always, make sure to go to gardul.com. That's GARDUL.com for the show notes. It'll be under podcasting, World Builder's Anvil. That's a great place to get all of the information from the episode that you've just listened to, and to see all the resources that we've talked about in this episode. Thanks for joining us this episode of the World Builder's Anvil. Please be sure to rate and review us in iTunes, and please help get the word out to your friends about our show. And join me, Jeffrey W. Ingram at Gardul.com, to see the progress of my world and learn why I made the choices I did. And please contact me and let me know the topics you would love to hear in the future. Now strike while the myth rolls high.